Welcome to everyone. Welcome to the Dallas Institute online. We sure wish we could offer our signature hospitality to you, gather with you physically, break bread, have a glass of wine or two, and come together as a community of learners, as has been our custom for 40 years. However, and alas, COVID prevents that, and I hope all of you are staying safe and well. I think we're in for an online treat tonight. A little background, the Institute has several groups that meet monthly, including two very special book groups that have been meeting for over 20 years to discuss contemporary, just published novels. In the fall of 2019, we read that year's Pulitzer Prize winner, The Overstory by Richard Powers, a prolific and not easy writer of long novels. It's right down our alley, and we had done some of his work before. But we weren't quite prepared for the impact on us of this novel about trees and, in a lesser troubling role, people. We had a bracing discussion for an hour and a half, but then we wanted more. We couldn't get enough of it, and we most likely annoyed our friends and families with the usual book fanatic imperative, you've got to read this book. And so we decided to return to it, invite some panelists who care deeply about trees and writing, and then annoy the whole city. And now that we're digital, even beyond the city, to come together to talk about these very real trees and these fictional people. So that's why we're here tonight. So thank you again for joining us. And you'll have a chance to weigh in on our conversation, as Josh said, a bit later in the program. After we hear briefly from each of our panelists, and then listen to their conversation among each other before turning to the audience, turning toward you. I'm going to be the facilitator, try to be as invisible as I can, and Josh and I will monitor your chat questions and comments and then submit them to our speakers. So let me begin by quickly introducing the panelists. Dr. Jaina Sanga is a professional writer who has published a novel, a book of short stories, and 2 novellas. Her fiction has won several prizes and led to her selection as a participant in prestigious residencies and workshops both in the US and abroad. She is a member of PEN America, has published a scholarly book on Salman Rushdie, is a fellow of the Dallas Institute, and a member of the Institute's board of directors. She is set to publish her 4th book of fiction very soon, a detective novel set in India and Dubai. Janette Monear is president and CEO of the Texas Trees Foundation, a private nonprofit focused on urban forestry, green infrastructure, and sustainable design. The foundation's strategic approach is based in research-driven data to mitigate the environmental challenges and related public health concerns that trees can alleviate. Janette's creative vision, collaborative commitment, and passion for trees has helped to transform the landscapes of North Texas and beyond. And even if we don't know it, we are enjoying presently the benefit of Janette's important work. Dr. Gail, let me introduce Mr. Ben Sandifer first. He's an author, photographer, and environmental advocate for the Great Trinity Forest and White Rock Lake. His award-winning nature photographs have been featured in local, state, and national publications. He is a certified master birder through North Central Texas Master Birder Program. In the Great Trinity Forest, Ben is a certified Texas Stream Team volunteer who monitors the water at Big Spring, one of the last free-flowing springs in Dallas. He was nominated for the 2016 Texan of the Year by the Dallas Morning News. And finally, Dr. Gail Thomas is a founding fellow of the Dallas Institute and creator of its Center for the City. Gail served as the Institute's founding director for 18 years and is author of Pegasus and Healing Pandora, and is editor of and contributor to Imagining Dallas and Stirrings of Culture. As director of the Institute's Center for the City, she has planned and directed more than 30 conferences focused on the city, and she is a life board member of the Dallas Institute. It's a great pleasure to have all of you here with us as panelists tonight. And I want to begin, Jaina, with you, and we'll go on first name basis. I want to begin with you and ask you to talk about, give us a little bit about the book itself. And especially since not everyone here, I think this is probably true, has read the book or maybe has not finished it. Very soon after its publication, you reached out to me and said, no question, our book groups have to read this extraordinary novel. So could you talk to us about it a bit?
Sure. When the book came out, I was actually doing a writing residency on Whidbey Island, which is off the coast of Seattle. And I had a cabin there, which was part of this writing residency called Hedgebrook that had been started by Gloria Steinman many years ago. And the writer in the cabin next to mine was a screenwriter by the name of Jane Anderson. And she's a screenwriter who wrote the screenplay for the film The Wife, starring Glenn Close. Some of you may have seen the film. And anyway, she asked me, she said, what are you reading? And I told her what I was reading at the time. And I said, what are you reading? And she said, oh, I'm reading this book about trees, which you should read. And I said, no, I'm not really into nonfiction. And she said, no, it's a novel. You should read this. And I just read the first 2 pages and I came back and I told Larry, I said, Larry, we have to read this. This is amazing. Anyway, there are 9 major characters and as many storylines in this novel. There's a biologist, a Vietnam War veteran, a psychologist, a lawyer, an artist, and a college student, and then there's other characters. But by the end of the novel, all but one become eco-activists. 2 of the characters end up in federal custody, 1 dies, 1 commits suicide, 2 go into hiding. And while the novel explores these characters' relationships to trees, ultimately, and I'm not sure how Richard Powers achieves this, but the book is not about these people at all. It's about the trees. I'll posit very briefly what I think will help us understand this novel in terms of the theory of it. And I'll start with one theorist, James Wood, whose book is called How Fiction Works. And Larry, you and I have talked at length about this book, and it's not a big book. It's quite a small book, but it's invaluable to looking at how novels work. And anyway, James Wood stresses free, indirect discourse. And his whole argument is based on the idea of point of view. Okay, so keep that thought at the back of your mind. His focus is very much on the individual. Okay, now another theorist, John Gardner, who has written a book called The Art of Fiction, for John Gardner, it is all about emotion. Okay, both the characters and us, the readers, that must sooner or later lift off from the particular and be transformed to some statement of value. So we have these 2 theorists that I'm putting forth. Gardner is more interested than Wood in fiction's moral capabilities, but even he places characters and the individual at the center of this morality. Okay, now the reason I'm telling you this, or kind of trying to go through this very quickly, is that all this, this theory of the novel focuses on the idea of the individual. Even the rise of the novel, which, the novel is quite a recent phenomenon. It started only in the 18th century. And, there's people argue that, okay, Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe was the first novel, or Cervantes' Don Quixote was the first novel. But anyway, the point is that it started in the 18th century and it coincided with the rise of the individual, okay? So now here comes Richard Powers with the Overstory. How does the Overstory function in this notion of the novel, which is theoretically about the individual self, right? So what Powers is doing in this novel is responding to critics like James Wood and John Gardner, that their view of fiction, our view of fiction so far, has been extremely limited. Okay, and so if you think about the novel in those terms, you'll see why when he posits trees as sentient beings, they're not just, simply characters and people, but they're sentient beings. This is the central axis of the book. The consciousness of trees exists on this earth on a much grander scale than ours. Okay, this is the main point that the novel is making. And the underlying message of the novel is that we learn to think beyond our individual selves, right? And so that's why I posited that theory of the novel as the individual. So what Richard Powers is doing is forcing us to sort of, think beyond that. So I'll end there, Larry.
Sorry, I always forget to unmute, but that's wonderful, Jaina. And your remarks bring to mind that America has a writer like Powers, although not as explicitly so, and that's William Faulkner, who wrote about the wilderness, the American wilderness, as sentient, as really having a life. He didn't get into the details the way Richard Powers wonderfully does in this novel, but what you said reminded me that Faulkner really does do that. So I want to stop and ask if any of our panelists have any comments or responses to what Jaina has said. Do you agree that the characters are? Is this too much to say, Jaina, that they're sort of minor presences?
Yes, exactly. I mean, and in the end, I mean, it's the novel is about the trees, right? And the characters are there to relate to us as we are the human beings reading this. And I think Richard Powers is doing something really unique that, I mean, we've read other works where, nature is important and so on, but in this particular way, through the language that he uses and through the characters and their specific scenarios, I mean, I have not seen this before, and he does it in a way that really is challenging the way we think about trees and our natural environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Are there some, do you have one or two or even more of those 9 characters that leap out at you more than others?
Nile Mehta, actually, the young man who sort of, he's in school and then he falls out of this tree. And the reason I'm thinking that they all kind of stand out, but the reason he stands out is because he's the only character who is, in my mind, consumed by self-questioning, right? And what does he question? He questions I think the urgency of activism versus the passivity of fatalism, right? He's a super intelligent kid. He creates a video game, and it's a world building game. And interestingly enough, the name of the game is Mastery. And he develops this business where millions of players sit in their bedrooms or their homes, creating these new Earths. And gradually, the game's popularity fades, and the virtual Earth comes to resemble our space, resemble ours, and is ravaged by greed and overdevelopment and profit. And Nile realizes this, of course, and there's no end game, and argues for setting limits, for setting taxes and rules and regulations, but his managers oppose this, and they say, what's the fun in setting limits, right? Why jeopardize the game's profitability? Let the obsessed players keep building infinitely, right? And that's the world we're in, right? I mean, if you think about it, the thing that I love about what Richard Powers does is that he makes us think. It's not an easy book to read by any stretch. And, but at the Institute, we love books that are complicated, right?
We do.
No.
We love challenges, and I agree with you that Nile Mehta is one of the main characters, and he has his shift, his change, his radical change after he reads the book by another main character, Patricia Westerfer, right, called The Secret Forest, about everything that goes on in the forest that we don't see and we're not aware of. So I hope we can get into some of those things a little bit later, but I agree with you, Jaina, about Nile. He's the most interesting character, I think, in the book. So let me move on and ask, so Janette, you do amazing transformative work in the world. You've left your imprint on our city, and there's much more to come. I'm involved in one of your latest projects, and so can you talk about your reaction to the book and how it resonates with your work?
Yeah, I thought the book was very interesting, and I looked at it, having worked in the field of forestry for 35 years. The book oftentimes brought back experiences that I've had, memories. It bubbled up a lot of emotions, both good and bad, and around the things that occurred in my life and the things that I understand from the work that I do and have done. I thought Powers did an excellent job of focusing on the characteristics of the trees, of course, more than the characteristics of the characters themselves. But I think what I found in the story, and the real story, was the parallel between the two different species and how humans, if more like trees, could be a stronger organism. Embracing diversity, codependency, and really looking at the need to recognize the symbiotic relationship that people and trees have. One of the things that the book did for me is it really did layer the various challenges and emotions and storylines and people and trees so that it regurgitated many reactions in me and creating many overstories that are all interconnected, like the ecosystem. Because everybody was interconnected in some way, and so are the trees. So the book did remind me that we're part of the ecosystem, and we're dealing with complex and integrated issues that begin to fall apart. Even when one small thing changes, it'll trigger another chain reaction that we don't always understand. In my work in urban forestry, there's a part of me that's had to always been very silent, and that's the spiritual connection that I have with trees. The work connection that I have with trees, working both in rural forest and urban forest, and they're two totally different forests. They're two different ecosystems. They're different biomes. It always comes back to one thing for me, and it's E.O. Wilson's Biophilic Effect. And biophilia is kind of the innately emotional affiliation of human beings to other living organisms. And people need trees. I think more than trees need people. But in order to survive, each species needs each other. And how we support each other, each species, is really the overall health of the ecosystem and how we will survive as a species. The symbiotic relationship, I think, Larry, between trees and people is not always kind of recognized. I think we've gotten away from being attuned to nature. And one of the things that I love about Ben is that he goes into the forest and he takes tours and he takes people and he awakens our reptilian brain to the fact that we are part of the ecosystem. We are connected to trees. They are important. Trees matter. And without trees, everything changes and everything is changing. So in my work in urban forestry has been just a lot different than my work when I was working at the University of Minnesota in the forest products in rural forest. And what I have tried to do is bring trees to where more than 80% of the people live, and that's in urban areas. And by doing that, we're reconnecting them with, I think, a soul connection in some ways to the trees and to the whole concept that we are just part of a whole, and that we have to really be cognizant of that, intentional about it. And the work that I do, I have to say, is hard. We're polarized around the environmental aspects. In the city of Dallas, I realized when I came to the city in 2007 from Minnesota. Now remember that Minnesota their economy is based in forestry and tourism. Here it was energy and individual rights, basically. So it was kind of the NIMBY, not in my backyard. There's been a huge change in Dallas. But that change really, I think, has come about by some of the work of the Texas Trees Foundation, because I realized that we had to not emotionally move into how we manage our urban forest, but we had to have it data-driven. And that's what people were understanding. So we started doing research in 2010. We did the State of the Dallas Urban Forest Report. From that, we found that 35% of our city is impervious surface, which makes us the second city in the country heating up the fastest. But lo and behold, trees are the answer, because the trees, just the shade of trees, cooling that urban environment, that concrete, that impervious surface, brings down temperatures by 12, 15 degrees. What I'm hoping that we can do in the city of Dallas is model how we can create, through urban design, a new paradigm. And it's a shift in how we design our cities for cars and for people. And the research is out there. I don't know, the research, Ulrich did research, and he showed that when you look at trees after having surgery out of the window, and you had a tree or a natural environment to look at as opposed to a brick wall, you had 20% less postoperative complications. We know that children with ADHD, when they're in trees, in forests and near trees and nature, have fewer symptoms. That lowers the symptoms of ADHD. So we know what's right. We have to look at how do we balance the emotional aspect of what we're doing and the importance of trees in our primal brain to what we're actually doing. And it's going to take the public will and individuals like Ben and like Gail and like all of us that are caring about trees, or we wouldn't be on this call tonight, to really make the difference. I thought he did an excellent job of kind of layering the different overstories.
That's terrific. Thank you, Janette. And we're really lucky to have you here. And so we appreciate everything that you've done and that you are going to do, because you're not done yet. And I want to move next to Ben Sandifer. Your life is so connected intimately with nature, flora and fauna, trees and birds. Gail and I were talking about this earlier. If we just told you to just start speaking tonight, we wouldn't have time to hear more than a very small portion, But can you tell us a little bit, at least, about your life with trees and how this book has affected you?
Thank you, Larry. I find that the book was very interesting from my perspective because I went into the book cold. I hadn't read anything about it. I hadn't read any reviews, and I didn't know what to expect out of a book that of substantial size and real meaty, where it would lead me. And it was an interesting perspective, my own personal reflection, reading the different, what is basically the first 120 pages or so of an anthology of short stories of character development that brings to life a world of humans and a world of trees. And I think it becomes apparent pretty early on that a book that I was originally told was going to be about trees, and then it reads often like it's a book more about people and their experiences with trees, reverts back to a lot of what Jaina discussed, how it really is a book about trees, and the speed of the book, the way the story's told, is about trees. And there are many different inferences that I could bring up about it, but I think maybe the overstory to all this, to some extent, is about how humans aren't the apex species that we think we are. That trees, for sure, are to some extent, even though that we have an ability to remove trees with our own hands, that trees really do run the show on this planet that we live on. Were it not for trees and their interaction with sunlight and the different plants that create the oxygen that we breathe, that we wouldn't exist here. And I think for me, that's one of the touchstones with the book. And the journey as we go through different parts of the book with the roots, the different connections that all this wide group of people have with and develop a love for trees. And then we see them all consolidate through the trunk of the book and then spread in very divergent directions, that, as Jaina mentioned, with an unfortunate ends to the lives of some of the characters and different journeys that are put on in life stories through others. And that spreads through the crown and the seeds of the book. And for me, it's fascinating because I've read a couple other books by Richard Powers where he explores artificial intelligence and neurology and photography, and you see inflection points from some of his other books in this book, and it's real interesting to read that and see how the book develops on some of these subtle nuances that I think that he enjoys probing into. One of the other parts of the book that is real interesting to me, even though it's a work of fiction, there's very much a nonfiction portion to it that explores not just science that's well established, but also touches quite a bit on forest intelligence, the symbiotic relationship that a lot of plants have with other plants that we think. And we see that through one of the characters in her plot development in dendrology. She's cast aside in a world and an industry that are full of men. Her career stalls out and she begins work and life on her own island, her own self-imposed island. And we see over the decades that her work becomes the work of others, one that's well established, vetted, professionally vetted, and becomes the current science, the science out in the real world today, outside of the book. And I think that for probably someone that doesn't interact much with trees or keeps abreast of different issues regarding the different flora that we have here in the United States, it really maybe questions and pops the question in your head in the book with what humans or the reader might think of themselves in the world in general. And that kind of goes back to some of what both Jaina and Janette said about maybe it questions our place, not just as caretakers of trees and forests, but also that they're part of something much larger that we really don't, as humans, as a species on Earth, don't have a lot of control over. If we read into some of these stories, the story, I think, if you were to ask me which character probably I relate to the most, and it's the Norwegian, Irish immigrant into New York City who collects chestnuts and takes them out to a farm in Iowa as part of, you know, the great westward expansion of America into Iowa, and plants a chestnut tree. And over the course of time, the family purchases a camera, a small little brownie camera, and over generations takes photos of this tree, and in the shoe, and leaves the photos in a shoebox for future generations. And flipping through those photos, as if you're just flipping through the photos one after another, it kind of creates a cartoon-like view of the tree, not so much, but more of all the human scurrying interaction that happens around the tree over multiple generations of families. And I think that really sets the tone for me in the book of an interest for me about the scale of time of the book. It's not, the scale of the book's not on human time, it's on tree time. And there are a lot of great quotes in the book that are kind of multi-dimensional and non-denominational and denominational, that touch on Christianity and Judaism and Buddhism. And it's wonderful to read the scoping across multiple generations of families, of ethics, thought processes. And then also where we have these protagonists in the book that are the main characters in the book that are also have antagonists against them. But I think that Richard Powers does a magnificent job of working some empathy in for some of the logging companies or the people that have to go remove trees out in front of an office complex, or you know, even in times of war, the reasons for removing some of the trees that were removed in the Vietnam War. So it's fascinating to read. There's so many different inferences and inflection points, I think, that it really does speak to a lot of people. And I can see, after getting through the book now 3 times, I've read it 3 times, how much it really, there's so many great nuggets in the book that I think can really have some real world applications. So, and I don't want to take up too much time. I don't know what I'm running time wise with this, but I think that for me, there are many things. Being around trees so much in the Dallas area, North Texas isn't known for trees as much as other parts of the world, but we do have one of the largest urban hardwood bottomland forests in the United States, which is part of a greater urban forest. The work that Janette does with the Texas Trees Foundation is a fundamental part of that, and how it works to keep our hottest weather cooler, our ozone days fewer, and creates a better sense of health for those of us that call DFW home. And I think that that's really what can, one of the big takeaways of this is not so much for me that there's so many oddball places where this book wanders to, but how it really does have a, you can bring something back home with it, just to the Dallas area with the work that's being done and trying to be done on preserving trees for the future. So, and those are some of my thoughts on the book initially, and some of my points, and coming from maybe a naturalist perspective on what I find interesting.
Well, thank you, Ben. And let me real quickly, before we move on, I've seen you in the woods. Gail's seen you in the woods. I'm sure Janette has seen you in the woods. And you have a wealth of head knowledge. You know, it just comes naturally out of you. But at the same time, I recall what Janette was talking about, a spiritual connection. And I see that in you as well. So my question is that the result of all the head knowledge that you've gained, and suddenly at one point it becomes a spiritual connection too? or did you walk into the woods one day and just were bowled over by its beauty or something like that?
Well, I've been a lot of places in the world where the beauty is jaw-dropping, and I think that for the Metroplex, and especially for my thoughts on my personal perspective on nature as an adult, comes from much what you and the Institute do, which is adult lifelong learning. I have this insatiable appetite for learning more about plants and trees and the world around me, and that's something that I read a lot about trees. I'm inquisitive, or plants and nature in general, and inquisitive and ask a lot of questions. But I think that my real interest in trees is the stories of trees that have persevered in a city in the Dallas area that is developer friendly, and we've seen development in a lot of areas. In the trees that are the big survivors that have survived since Dallas was in its infancy. It's survived the whole economic development buildup of one of the largest cities in North America. And for me, my emotion flows mostly through trees that are witness trees, trees that have seen and had a half a dozen languages spoken underneath them. When they were acorns, they were New Spain. Where we're speaking this evening. And for me, that's the emotion that goes into it, are these trees that sometimes would be lost in the dustbin of history that are just waiting to be found. There are many trees out there that have a story to tell, and it's interesting to sit underneath them. And I don't speak to them. Perhaps it's more that they tell me a story when I visit them and see their scars and wounds and ice storms and windstorms and different things that have happened to them. So that's the my perspective on that.
Thank you, Ben. Yeah, that's great, wonderful. Trees telling us stories. So let me turn to you, Gail. I think everyone who knows you knows that you love our city. You've championed green spaces within it for decades. And there's also an actual forest, a big woods forest in your life that you consider a sanctuary. Can you tell us something of your own experience with trees and the impression this book has had on you?
There we go.
There you go.
I'm so grateful Ben is talking about the impact these placeholder trees have had in our city. On my walks in Bluffview area, I live in Bluffview, and I've walked around here for 36 years, and I always try to find the trees that were part of the old original Bluffview farms that have never been cut, the original trees, and we have found them. There's an Asian custom of when you see something so beautiful, you suck your teeth, that kind of expression. And so I've been doing that. I have been doing that on my walks. I also have in East Texas, my husband and I, 40 years ago, bought a beautiful piece of East Texas piney woods, pines and hardwoods. And we were able to walk in those woods last weekend together. And what a beautiful experience that was. There's one tree, a sycamore, that is just an ancient tree, and it has at the trunk of the tree what was obviously, I believe, a grave and a gravestone. And so the gravestone has now is part of the trunk of the tree. And we've honored that. We have honored that gravestone and that tree all these years, and mow around it, giving it its space and its honor. Now, I want to talk, what I've focused on in my remarks is how nature is talking to us. The book offers such an awakening, especially now, I think, with this virus. And there's a conundrum at work that I want to focus on. On one end is the deadly virus robbing us of our breath. And at another end, all forms of nature are showing themselves as never before. In verdant vibrancy of color, in birdsong. On these early morning walks, I've noticed that birds remain close on a tree limb instead of flying away, much, much more than I've ever noticed before. And squirrels scampering about a yard, and I'm on the pavement, those squirrels will come right up to the pavement and be close, allow themselves to be close. I think the thing that's so powerful about this book is the recognition that a different intelligence is available to us. And we've not attempted to get in touch with it. There's so much more going on in the plant kingdom that we've not come to terms with. It's an intelligence that we thought of at some lower level. And we now know it's highly, highly intelligent. Nothing is there on its own separate steam. It's all connected. Now, Richard Powers says, what if there is meaning out there? We've treated ourselves as independent, autonomous agents. We cannot survive that way. And ultimately, he says, writing this book was a spiritual activity. So I want to point to two examples. Larry has asked us to identify either one or more of these characters that were important to us. And for me, of course, the main one was Patricia Westerfer, or Plant Patty, who is a scientist. Patricia is born with a speech defect and a hearing impairment. She has irregular features. So Patty was shunned as a little girl. Her schoolmates made fun of her. But her father was an agricultural extension agent and took her with him into the countryside, into the fields and the forests, and taught her about nature's world. And I thought it might be fun just quickly to read some of his language, so for you to hear some of his language. This is Patty riding with her father into the country. Mile after plowed mile, they hold their roving tutorial. He faces her so she can read his moving lips. She laughs at his stories, thick, slow booms, and stabs enthusiastic answers to each of his questions. Which is more numerous, the stars in the Milky Way or the chloroplasts on a single leaf of corn? Which trees flower before they leaf and which flower after? Why are the leaves at the top of trees often smaller than those at the bottom? And this was her favorite always. If you carved your name 4 feet high in the bark of a beech tree, how high would it be after half a century? 4 feet. 4 feet, always 4 feet. No matter how high that beech tree grows, it's still 4 feet. Now I want to contrast Plant Patty, with the other really important figure for me, which was Nile Mehta. And Jaina, you mentioned Nile, and so did Larry. At age 7, his father brought home a computer kit, and together they constructed this wondrous little box. His father said when they finished assembling the kit, "Now, Nileji, what might this little creature do?" So here they were, first generation Southeast Asian who has a passion for computers. and who also creates artificial life. Now, he was crippled from a fall from a tree, and he lives his life in a wheelchair. Nile builds an enormous gaming industry with followers throughout the world. And he works on this role-playing space opera. He works for months on it. Now, the thing that I thought was such a remarkable conundrum in the book is that Patricia Westerfer, who worships nature, lives in nature, it's her whole being, her whole life. And at the end of her life, she commits suicide. Nile lives in a world of artificial nature, creating an opera that is put together by people all over the globe, creating this world of just remarkable trees and plants and that are unimaginable. And Nile has an epiphany. He's on the Stanford campus. He's in Rodin's garden there with the statues. And he has an epiphany of a world that is created through the computer. And he has this because he sees for the first time a tree that has been brought in and he had never noticed it before. Now that, I don't know, do I have time to read one more little section, Larry?
Yes, you do.
Okay. There in a car-sized planter, just to the side of the chapel entrance, bulbous and elephantine, is the most mind-boggling organism he has ever seen. It's the thing he's been searching for his intergalactic opera. A living hallucination from a nearby star system at the other end of a wormhole in space. The groundkeepers must have snuck it in last night under cover of dark. Either that or he has rolled past it in his wheelchair every evening for months without ever seeing it. He cannot decide which is more incredible, the tree or the fact that he's never noticed it. Something is happening then at this moment behind his back. He has the overwhelming feeling of being watched. A silent chorus in his head sings, turn around and see. He spins his wheelchair in space. Nothing is right. The whole cloister courtyard has changed. One hyper jump and he's landed in an intergalactic arboretum. Now he tumbles around. He rolls from planter to planter, touching the beings, these beings that are trees and plants, smelling them, listening to their rustles. They've come from hot islands and desiccated outback, from remote valleys in Central Asia and so on. Now the Japanese tourists who were there with him in the courtyard leave. Nile is alone in his wheelchair. He's only alone a few seconds, but in that interval, the alien invaders insert a thought directly into his limbic system. There will be a game 1 billion times richer than anything yet made. To be played by countless people around the world at the same time. And Nile must bring it into being. He will unfold the creation in gradual evolutionary stages over the course of decades. The game will put its players smack in the middle of a living, breathing, seething, animist world filled with millions of different species. A world desperately in need of the players' help. And the goal, this is the key, The goal of the game will be to figure out what the new and desperate world wants from you. It's a remarkable thing that Richard Powers is doing here, because we're seeing the world destroyed all around us by greed and just money, economy. And so nature is destroyed, but artificial nature, it is suggested, after centuries and centuries, bring us back to a consciousness of what is needed by the world. And Richard Powers says, he rolls out of the cloister as the light vanishes behind the mountains. The hills cast a shadow on themselves, bruised blue, turning to forgetful black, and so on. And down in the cool riparian corridors, smelling of silt and decaying needles, redwoods work a plan that will take 1,000 years to realize. The redwoods work a plan that will take 1,000 years to realize. The plan that now uses him, Nile, although he thinks it's his. So I wanted to bring to light that consciousness that is at work, that's masterful, I think, Richard Powers has given us.
Thank you, Gail. I'm so glad to have some of these passages read, because he is, all of you have said, he's just an amazing writer. And I want to invite us to submit questions to the chat room and spend a little bit of time letting you question our panel to see. We do have one from Christopher, who says, the character of Patricia Westerfer reminds me of Diana Beresford Kroger. And then the note, Janette knows about her work. So what do you think?
Do you know her work, Janette?
I do know her work. She's done some pretty phenomenal work. She's from Canada, and she is really one of the first ones to speak out about kind of the intellectual persona of trees. And I related to her when I was doing the public television documentary, Spirit of the Trees. And as I did that, and I honestly haven't shared this with a lot of people, but we had experiences with trees talking to us. Mm-hmm. And it was very disconcerting at the beginning, but working in the Native American community, it became just a part of the culture, but it became a part of who I was. When I mentioned I haven't had a voice sometimes, because many years ago in the early 80s, I had a very intimate connection with trees through, I can see their auras. I had them talk to me, but I never, until Diana talked about her experiences, were ever able to articulate them. We were in the woods one day, and we were looking at a tree, and we were taking a sample, and I heard, "I'm not the tree, it's the double tree behind you." And I took and looked around, and there was a double tree behind me. And I said to the team that was with me, "Who said that?" And they all looked at me and said, "What?" And so I said to Michelle, "I just heard it's the double tree behind me." And she said, and she was the Native American that was showing us how she gathers tree bark to make kappa cloth. And so she looked at me and I looked at her, and we knew the tree had spoken. Mm-hmm. I think that this is true, Gail, that, and Diana believes that too, and I think we're going to find more of that. And I think when you go into the trees, into the forests, yes, there's more oxygen, but I think what we're going to find is that the trees are really our human batteries in many ways, and are undeniable, kind of in some ways subconscious.
So,
and it's pretty powerful when we worked with the Native American community, because that is their culture. They live with the trees. They live with the land. They don't try to dominate the land.
So Janette, let me jump in here and ask a question, widen it out to everybody, because what you say reminds me that, in a lot of places in the book, we hear that the trees are giving signals and messages to the characters. I mean, the very first image with the preface with Mimi Ma sitting against a tree, she's hearing signals. And this is a quote from the book: "The pine she leans against says, 'Listen, there's something you need to hear.'" And at one point, one of the characters is swarmed by these things. And Olivia, remember that she's electrocuted and dies and comes back to life. And then she can hear the trees speak, and the trees say to her, "The world starts here." So this is my question to you all. And it might be a literary question, Jaina, but I think it's an existential question as well. Are these messages from trees meant to be taken as fantasy or reality? To put it another way, in what sense can we hear trees or learn to hear trees if we know how to listen?
I think in that the opening scene, that the first page that you're for Mimi's experience, I think he's referring to what Janette was just talking about, right? That she can really hear them, that the trees are talking to her. And maybe it's not a language that has a script even, but it's nonetheless, it is a language. But the only way that Richard Powers can communicate that to us, the reader, is through language and through the script that we have. But what Janette was saying, that you felt the tree talking to you, I think that issue of language, and I would love to ask Richard Powers that what is another sort of substitute for language? Maybe communication is in some way.
Yes.
Larry, can I add something here?
Absolutely.
I have just been reading the book by Belden Lane called The Great Conversation, Nature and Care of the Soul. And I want to read something what he writes in this book that I think you'll find interesting. He says, in talking to a tree, I am hearing no spoken utterance. What we experience together is largely nonverbal, received bodily. It's more of a shared presence than anything decipherable in language. It's untranslatable, and unquantifiable.
That makes sense. And so what that tells me then, because I'm sensing something in this book and from hearing you all talk that I want to experience, right? So that there is a way in which to learn this language, or to learn to communicate in this way. Ben, am I off base here?
Yeah, I think for sure that trees communicate with one another, because we see trees that I do from personal experience that will drop if there's a stressful event that occurs, construction nearby, that they will all have this sympathetic fruit drop or acorn drop, thinking that there's danger ahead, that they themselves, I think one of the only things that trees don't have going for them is that they can't pick up and walk away and plant themselves down somewhere else. But I really do think that trees do have a way to communicate with us, to tell us things. And there have been a number of times when I've been out in the woods by myself, I don't feel like I'm alone, especially in some of these older, more charismatic groves of trees, that there's a real character to them that can't be explained. I know we often think of them as inanimate objects that just kind of fill the background to our lives, but I think that certainly there is some component of them that speaks on a base language with us, and there's a real salient passage that Powers puts in his book. Mm-hmm. He writes, "You and the tree in your backyard come from a common ancestor. 1.5 billion years ago, the two of you parted ways. But even now, after an immense journey in separate directions, that tree and you still share 1/4 of your genes." Yeah. And I think that there must be some connection there. Yeah. That quarter of myself and then the oak tree in my front yard, we're both brothers in this all together. So I think that's very resonant with the commentary that's ongoing with this discussion.
So one thing you said cries out to be noted because you talked about charismatic trees.
Sure. They're trees that have witnessed the complete birth of this city and of this state, and they're trees that hold a lot of character as well. And just like if you could imagine some of the older homes or along Swiss Avenue in Dallas, for example, some of our historic homes, well, they're also historic trees that provide shelter for generations of different animals, but also human lives. We've seen some of the trees that are in Dallas at the Pioneer Cemetery, for example, that have seen some of the oldest growth post oak savanna trees in Texas that still exist. No human planted them. They were there before the first person was buried at Pioneer Cemetery. Oakland Cemetery is another great example in South Dallas near Fair Park, where these oak trees have witnessed the entire history of human events long before European settlement of what we now call Dallas. Native Americans walked across their land and used the shade of their trees underneath them on a hot day. So I think that these historic trees are touchstones. I can get really deep in the woods with discussion about that, but I think that for me, especially knowing the character of a tree, the history of a tree, there's some there's good history and history that stands in communities like the Freedmen's Town of Joppy, where there's still a tree that was part of a whipping ground back in the 1920s that was used by the Ku Klux Klan as a whipping ground for African Americans. And one of those trees still stands in the Great Trinity Forest. And at that tree, the sense that you get there, I took Mark Lamster, the architecture critic of the Dallas Morning News, down to this tree, and he felt something. He felt that I did too. I can't put words in his mouth, but there's this aura of the tree wanting to tell you its story. And it's an emotional place to be so far out in the woods, and not even him knowing that, Mr. Lamster knowing the history of this tree, feeling that something terrible and awful happened here at that spot. So I feel that around some of these larger, older trees that have stories to tell, and it's a wonderful experience to be able to source out some of these trees using a lot of data and background information and old maps and old surveys to find those.
That's great. Gail, you were going to say something.
Oh, well, I was going to comment to Ben. We talked about the tree around Big Spring, that ancient old tree, and the power of that one.
And I don't know how many people know what Big Spring is.
Right. So Big Spring sits in the heart of the Great Trinity Forest, and it also is the first City of Dallas historical landmark that's basically completely of natural origin. So we have a lot of really great landmarks inside the City of Dallas: Dealey Plaza, Fair Park, the Old Red Courthouse. But down the list, and one of the newest City of Dallas landmarks, but also one of the oldest, is Big Spring. And at the heart of Big Spring is one of the largest bur oaks in the state of Texas. And that bur oak shaded John Neely Bryan and his family when they lived on the property a century and a half ago. That bur oak tree has shaded the Native American hunting parties. Their arrowheads and artifacts are scattered all around Big Spring. And that tree is a living witness. We don't know how old it is. Some people think it's up to 400 or 500 years old, which would mean that basically, for as uncommon as it is to have something that old in North Texas, we believe that tree might predate European discovery of the Americas.
Wow.
It's a great old tree.
And
we hope it lives for another 500 years.
Thank you, Ben. And I'm aware of our time getting away from us. And I wanted to ask a couple more questions. One of them to Jaina. I guess this is a literary perspective. We've talked about Patricia Westerfer, and we've mentioned that Gail did her extreme and very dramatic move at the end toward the end of the novel. How does that work literarily for you? Did you think? Was it a shot? Was it does it work well there?
I think so. I mean, it's very calculated, and it's a shock, right? But I think I think it's resolved well, and I don't want to argue with Richard Powers about what he puts in terms of the plot. Right. The plot is the plot. It happened that way because it happened, and that's fine with me. So.
But didn't you think? I thought the powerful moment was when Neely expressed he screamed.
He wants to save her,
and that was what struck me about these two characters in the book. Patricia Westerfer is almost more like a tree herself than a human being. I mean, she's almost not a human being. She's almost an organic tree being. And so symbolically, she is killed. She kills herself. But it's Neely who's involved in artificial intelligence and the things that we do not equate with nature itself, that Richard Powers does this amazing spin that ultimately will save nature itself. And whether you agree with him or not, but I thought it was a powerful turn.
But one of the things that makes it work for me is that she has come to the conclusion that what she needs to do while she's still alive is to start the seed bank, right? That is able to allow her to release herself from this world in this dramatic gesture, right? And what is it that she's answering the question? What is the single best thing a person can do for tomorrow's world? And her suicide is the answer to that question. So I think it's a wonderful moment. I want to ask one last question as we move toward the end of our time, because we haven't talked about the ending yet. The novel doesn't end when Patricia Westerfer kills herself or when Neely Mehta, has his, he almost stands up out of his chair to tell her not to do it. It really is wonderful. But then it goes on, and it goes on to that Chestnut guy, Ben, or the great grandson of him, Nick, who is out in the woods, right, making tree art. Remember, and he's in the deep woods, and he's pulling logs around in certain arrangements to make tree art. And then suddenly a Native American man with a red plaid shirt appears and asks him what he's doing, right? And he tells him, and then the man comes back the next day when Nick is still working with two husky young men, and they finish the artwork. And do you remember what the artwork says?
Yes. Still.
Still. Okay. And satellites can measure it from way up in the heavens, and everybody can see them, you know. All right. So that's the last word we might say of the novel. So what are we to do with that? We've lost Patricia, you know, and you know, a lot has happened. Olivia's dead, you know, things like that. But how are we to regard this ending moment of the novel, do you think?
Well, I think that we could probably think back to a quote in the book that kind of really resonated with me, and that's that this is not our world with trees in it. It's a world of trees where humans have just arrived. And I think that kind of comes full circle a number of places in the book, but especially in the end with that piece of work, that artwork in the woods.
Yeah.
It really resonates and kind of comes full circle with tying together a number of different stories in the book.
Yes. And that Richard Powers, he picks a word here that has two meanings, right?
Right. We're still, and I think so are the trees.
Yeah.
But I think that there's a very symbiotic relationship that's within both. It's a real deep thought comment from that can mean, I think it can mean different things to different people, but for me that's what it meant.
Yeah.
I thought one interesting Larry was that the Native American was there, and he showed up out of kind of nowhere. But I think the other thing about it, which was kind of interesting to me, is bringing at the very end back the story of the chestnut tree, which is the chestnut tree is millions of years old. And it was on the brink of being lost. And quite frankly, people brought it back.
Yeah, yeah.
So I think that for me, it was a hopeful, it was showing the kind of the trees were here on Turtle Island, as the Native Americans say, before, but then the indigenous community was here. It will still be here for a long time to come.
Thank you for that, Janette, because that's exactly what I'm feeling too. Anyone else?
So Larry, if I may, I have a quick question for Gail and, well, the other panelists as well. And, you know, reading this book the second time for, you know, in preparation for this, I kind of wanted to, you know, sort of think outside what was going on and what Richard Powers was trying to do and what we could do at the Institute and in our city. You know, what lessons and what our responsibility is from now that we know what we know from Richard Powers and about trees. And Janette, you were saying, you know, that it is so helpful to be in the forest and that the trees actually have the power to heal us. So what are ways in which, and Gail, this is specifically for you, and I know you've thought about this, and how do we make our forests, you know, safe for everyone? You know, a Black person or a brown person walking in the forest is immediately suspect.
Good point.
It's an excellent point, and one for us to think very seriously about. The Trinity, when we did the Trinity project, we worked with the Communities Foundation on a security grant. And we worked for 2 years on this grant with neighbors in the Great Trinity Forest, and have had many extraordinary ideas about how to create a safe path through the forest. Now, I know Ben could speak to this as well, much more than I, but I know that the planning, the fundamental planning has been done. And what we need is to get, for each one of us to feel that we can get out into our Trinity forest and walk the paths along the Trinity River. And I mean, right now with COVID, it's the perfect time to take these treks out into our Trinity. The whole purpose of doing the Trinity Project was to bring nature into the heart of the city. And we have, if we could revisit some of those ideas, I think it could be helpful. Thank you for the question.
Larry, I think a couple of things is some of the work that we're doing with the Texas Trees Foundation. It's not a forest like the Trinity Forest, but at the intersection of Harry Hines and Inwood, it will be a 10-acre forest. And that's the project you're working on with us. Our school campuses, we're working with DISD, and we're planting a minimum of 80 trees on each campus. Good. And aligning that with the curriculum. But I would like to ask everybody that's on this call is tomorrow to go outside and take your shoes off, put your hands on the tree, go to the tree, on a tree that it'll attract you. And I want you to put your hands on the tree. I want your bare feet on the ground. I want your eyes closed. And I want you to feel the energy that tree will share with you, because it's like a circular energetic field that you will feel if you are concentrating and kind of thinking about that, because they're here to kind of cleanse and help us heal ourselves.
Can we report back to you, Janette?
I would love that.
That's wonderful.
And that, Janette, thank you.
That tree, that forest at Inwood and Harry Hines is the project that you're working on right now, right? And you're bringing people all across the city into the sphere of that. So that's exciting.
Yeah.
So, we've had a great flurry of chat messages just here in the last few minutes. Josh, can we capture these and send them to the group?
Capture the ideas?
The chat messages, and I can
yes, it will
anonymize them and because they're really good, talking about the ending of the thing and talking about some of the things here in Dallas. One suggestion, and it comes from Melanie. Hi, Melanie, that we ought to, when we can get together, we ought to have yet another session about this novel because it just doesn't quit. And so there's some really great things here. So we'll take a look at these and get back to everyone with some of these things. So thank you all for being with us. And, it's been a very rewarding thing for me to be in on this conversation. And to those of you who are not familiar with the Institute, we're a program organization. If you're into learning and if you're interested in the humanities, check us out at dallasinstitute.org. We're in full swing with our fall programs. They're all online. And I invite you to look over our membership program and consider becoming a member. And we'd especially love to have you with us on November 11th for our 16th Hyatt Prize in the Humanities Award. It's a virtual gala. A ticket start at $25. We give a $50,000 prize to a young person who has gone into the humanities as a career. So I hope we see you again soon. In the meantime, please stay safe and well. And thank you for a great evening. Goodbye.
Thank you all.
Goodbye. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.